back to the new video in the tutorial series Introduction to Kubernetes. Today we are going to learn about RBAC, or known as role-based authentication or access control. Little bit about me, I am JainishShah. These are the links that you can use to follow me on GitHub, Twitter and LinkedIn. So what is rollback or RBAC? A role-based access control. It's a way to basically restrict permissions on Kubernetes resources for user or service accounts. Right? It's used for authorization. So, for example, if you want some particular user to only read objects like pods or deployments or stateful set or services, you can use RBAC to do that. Now, why RBAC? So, each users in Kubernetes needs some amount of security, right? Think about use cases where you have two teams, your development team and your QA team, using the same Kubernetes cluster. Now, it can happen that if you give both of them or both group a permission to do everything, right, a kind of admin permission, then it can happen that QA team member accidentally deleting some of the objects of developer team. And exactly to avoid this kind of accidents, RBAC is required. So RBAC has four different entity or objects that we can use to control permissions or to allow restrictions. So first is role. Now role in Kubernetes is it can be attached to service account or a group or a user, but role is always a namespace controlled. Right, it's always associated with a namespace. So if you want to allow some entity or some identity, it can be group, user or a service account, to only access some part in particular namespace, then you can use role. Now only creating role won't work. You will need to bind that role to some entity. As I mentioned, it can be group, user or service account, and to do that you need role binding, right? So role binding is used to bind a role to particular identity in particular namespace. Now the other entity is cluster role. Cluster role is, as the name suggests, it's for entire cluster, right? It's not limited to particular namespace. That is the big difference between role and cluster role. Now you can use cluster role to grant permission within individual namespace or namespaces, or you can use cluster role to grant permission across all the namespaces. And you can also use that to scope resources based on cluster scope. And to bind or to attach that cluster role to identity same as a role, you need cluster role binding. So these are the four objects that we will use to allow or to restrict activities of users, service account or groups on the cluster. So let's get to the meat. Let's go to the demo, and what we will do is we will go through a demo of creating a user and attaching a role and cluster role to it to restrict some permission. So we will create a user and create a role and a cluster role and bind it to that user. Also in the second part we will create service account, and we will do the same thing. We will create a role and attach a role and cluster role to that service account. So let's start with service user first. So just to give more information on role, we are creating one role called developer role, and we are giving permission to developer role that they can get, list, watch, create, update, patch and delete deployments, replica sets, pods and service accounts. So pretty much deploying an application, we are giving permission to do that, right? And then we are binding that role to a namespace called development. right? You can see we are binding that role to user. I'm using my name as a user Jainish. You can also attach that to service account or a group, right? And then we will create a cluster role. So that's also another kind. We are creating a cluster role to read secrets, right? And as name suggests, it will be a role across the cluster, across the Kubernetes clusters, and we are giving permission to read resources secrets. The user part of who is attached to this role can get, watch, and list all the secrets in the all namespaces. And then what we do is we use cluster role binding to bind that cluster role to particular user or particular identity. Here the user is Jainish, and here you can see there is no namespace bind, and we are referencing the cluster role that we created to this user. Now you might ask how to create users. So here I have created all the steps how you can create a user. So let's go ahead and start with creating a user. I assume that you have your Kubernetes cluster up and running. In my case, I'm using Minikube, so I can check Minikube status, and my Minikube is up and running. And as of now, if I don't have anything deployed, right? So now let's see whether RBAC is enabled on my Kubernetes cluster or not. Running this command, it will give us the API version supported by your Kubernetes cluster. Now Kubernetes by default after version 1.1 or something, I believe, RBAC is always enabled. Now let's create a namespace called development, because for roles we need a namespace where we can restrict functionality of particular role in the namespace. Now what we are doing is we are creating a private key for user. Now if you want to create a user, you need to create a signed certificate and a private key. Then you will need to authorize that key or sign that key with your Kubernetes clusters key, and then you will be able to use those as a credential with your user to perform operation on Kubernetes cluster. So this is the command to create a key. So let's create a key, and you can see the key has been created. And then I am creating basically I'm creating a certificate to sign my PAM key. So, and you can see there will be, if I do ls, there is a key file created and CSR file created. Now we will need to locate Kubernetes cluster certificate authority, and if you are using Minikube, it will be in this directory, in your home directory there will be .minikube directory, and we can see here these are the two certificates, CA key and CA cert. Then this we will need this to sign the certificate and the key that we have generated, right? And this is the command to do that. If you are using this command, make sure you replace the path, and I will need sudo permission to do that. And you can see my key is signed now, and it will generate a new key file. Then what we will do, we will move both cert file and key file to a proper location. So I will move it in the Minikube directory. You can create a new folder and put your key there as well. Now we are setting the credential, right, and in our context. So first I'm saying that, hey, the user I want to use is Jainish, and I want to use the key and certificate to use with that user. And you can see the config set credential is done. Now I will set a context to use my cluster with this namespace and as a user Jainish. If I do that, the context is created. Now in case it says modified, because I had previously created. Now if you want to try the newly created context, you can use this command. If I do that, I will get an error, right? It says that user Jainish cannot list resources because that user does not have permission. The user is created, it can perform operations again the Kubernetes cluster, but as we haven't gave him that user a permission, it cannot list the pods. Now what we'll do, we will create a role. So let's create the role. A role is created, then we will bind that role, right? And let's create the cluster role as well. Or if we don't do that first, so let's use the same command again. If I do get pods, you can see now we are able to get pods, but if I do get secrets, it will error out because we don't have any permission to read secret using the username Jainish. Now let's create the cluster role and let's bind that cluster role so that we can give permission to read secret to user Jainish. And now if I use the command get secret, it will give me the output, and you can see we are able to read secret from the namespace, all the namespaces, right? This is coming from namespace default, I believe, but if you want to see the secrets from all namespaces, you can use all namespaces flag and you can see all the secrets. So that's pretty much about how you can use the user, and you can use role and role binding or cluster role and cluster binding. These are some commands that Kubernetes provide to see what permissions you have, to whether you have permission to perform some operation or not, right? So now let's move back to a second part, which is creating a service account. Now service account is usually used for kind of your automated user. So it can be a CI user, it can be a build user, it can be a QA user, right? So for this example, what we'll do is we will create a new namespace called CI. Now let me see what is my current context. So I will do config kubectl config, and I think to get the current context is the command, and you can see current context is Minikube, so which has all the permission as it's an admin context. So I will use that to create a namespace. Let's create a namespace. It's created. Then I will create a service account called Jenkins in my case, and service account is created. Now service account is usually attached to namespaces. So if you see if I do kubectl get service account, it will give service account from the current namespace. Right now it's default, but if I use all namespace flag, then we can see all the default service account created by Kubernetes. Now let's go and create a role. Similar way we did for user, we are creating another role called secret reader. So let's do that, and this time we are using command line to do or perform this operation. And the role is created. Now we are binding role, and you can see this time instead of binding it to user, we are binding it to service account. And in service account we are specifying the namespace because our service account Jenkins is created in default namespace. And we are going to create the cluster role pod reader as well. So we are doing a vice versa now. In example of user, we created a role for pod reader and cluster role for secret reader. Now we are creating role for secret reader and cluster role for pod readers. And we are binding the cluster role binding, everything is done. Now in case of service account, so when you create a service account, so let me just get the service account. And when you create service account, the Kubernetes by default generates a token. So let me do describe service account, and in this case we will describe service account Jenkins. So you can see here that it has created a secret for token, right? And it's run automatically by Kubernetes. Now if you and it's created in the same namespace. If you do get secrets, you will see that secret is created, and that secret holds the token, token for the user to perform operation, for that service account to perform operations, right? And it's base 64 encoded. So we will use this command, which will get us a token and set it as a variable token. And you can see it's done. Now let's set that credential. So we are saying that, hey, the user will be Jainish and I'm Jenkins, and I am using token instead of client certificate and key. I am using the token to authenticate, and this context is set. Credentials are set. Now let's create the context. So context, we are saying that context name will be Jenkins, cluster same Minikube. And now we are also using user flag, but instead of Jainish, which was username, now we are passing the service account name. And obviously we are using namespace CI, right? So Jenkins context is created, and now if you want to test that, you can use this way as well. You can change the context to Jenkins, right? And now if you perform the operation get pods, you will be able to get all the pods, right? Because we have created the role and cluster role to perform that operation. But if I try to do, let's say get deployments, then it will error out because the service account Jenkins does not have permission to list get deployments, right? If you want to do that, we might need to edit the permission, edit the role and allow permission to perform operation on deployments, right? And as been listed in the user, these are the some commands that you can run to see whether the user has permission to do perform certain operation or not. And you can see here it can get all pods from all namespace. It can get secrets from all namespace, no, but it can get secret from the current namespace, which is CI. Okay, something is bad. I think role name was not proper, but you know that this is how you can do. You can use RBAC to control access or permissions in the Kubernetes cluster. That's pretty much it. Thank you for watching this video. I hope you have learned something about the RBAC. If you have any question, feel free to add your question in the comment, and I will try to answer your questions. And please subscribe to my channel if you want to keep learning new thing about the Kubernetes. With that, thank you, and we'll see you in next video.